He was born as storms gathered above the Republic, in a villa outside Picenum, where the hills were wild and the laws weaker than swords. His father, Pompeius Strabo, was a consul and a soldier, feared more than loved. He taught his son how to endure silence, how to wear armor before he could read Cicero's words, and how to trust no one who smiled too quickly. The boy learned, and he remembered. Lucius Pompeius Magnus was not born a legend. He became one in the shadow of another man's war. When Sulla rose like a flame from the east, promising order through steel, young Pompey did not hesitate. Though only 23, he gathered 3 legions, not given, but raised by his own name, his own wealth, his own fire. With no formal title, he marched to meet Sulla, not as a servant, but as a rival star. Sulla, cold and calculating, did not trust easily. But when he saw Pompey, he did not see a boy. He saw Rome's future, obedient, brilliant, and useful. They called him Agila Sentulus Carnifex, the teenage butcher, for the speed with which he dealt death. In Sicily and Africa, he restored sullen order with terrifying efficiency. Where rebels stirred, he stamped. Where governors wavered, he replaced. He sailed with discipline, marched without rest, and executed judgment like an old man cloaked in a young body. And the triumph, the first of 3, was his reward. Rome had never seen a general so young ride in golden chariot through her streets, laurels above his brow and prisoners trailing behind. The people chanted Magnus, the Great, and the name clung to him like sunlight to marble. Sulla watched, wary. "Do not call him Magnus too soon," he whispered. But the crowd had already spoken. And Pompey, for all his modesty, did not correct them. He wore the name with pride, and with fear. For every triumph was a debt. Every ovation a warning. In the Republic, glory invited knives. And Pompey, though still young, began to feel the weight of eyes upon him, some adoring, others sharpened by envy. He returned to private life briefly, but he was no longer private. His house was watched. His allies multiplied. His enemies studied. He had not entered politics, but already the Senate murmured his name as if it were a prophecy. He had power, but no title. Command, but no office. Reputation, but no root in Rome's cruel maze of privilege. He had won war for others. But who would he become, if he ever fought for himself? They crowned him with laurel before he had gray. A boy with a general's name and no place to stay. But every gold trumpet that sings through the air also calls shadows to gather and stare. The sea had grown wild. No longer a road for grain and goods, but a graveyard of Roman pride. Pirates, once scattered raiders of the eastern shoals, now swarmed in fleets. They dared to blockade harbors, sack temples, and even kidnap praetors. Rome, mistress of the Mediterranean, could not feed herself, for every ship that left Alexandria risked never returning. The Republic, bloated with veterans and rhetoric, looked inward and argued while the waves laughed. In desperation, the Senate turned to fear. And fear wore a familiar name, Pompey. He was granted a command like none before. 3 years. Absolute authority. Control over the sea and all coastlands within 50 miles. 75% of Rome's world. Some protested, citing tyranny, tradition, the shadow of kings. But the people cheered. They remembered the young general who brought order to Africa. They believed he would tame the deep. Pompey did more. He divided the sea like a strategist divides the field, into sectors, zones, breathing maps of fire and steel. He moved with speed no Roman expected, striking from Brundisium to the Balearics, from Crete to Cilicia. Where pirates hid, he descended like thunder without mercy or delay. Within months, not years, the sea was Roman again. They surrendered to him by the thousands, sometimes without a fight. He spared many. He did not revel in their blood. Instead, he resettled them. Built them towns. turned raiders into farmers, and slaves into subjects. It was not just war. It was statecraft. And it worked. Rome was stunned. For the first time in memory, grain prices fell, ships returned safely, and the cries of mothers at the port ceased. The people had called him Magnus. Now they called him Navarchus, commander of the waves. He did not return for ovation. He barely paused. For even as the pirates fell, the east stirred again. Mithridates, old enemy of Rome, rebelled anew, his alliance with Tigranes of Armenia threatening to engulf Asia once more in fire. And the Senate, reluctant and proud, once again hesitated. Pompey did not. He requested command. And when it was granted, he took the legions east, not for plunder, not for vengeance, but because he believed peace had a shape, and he could carve it. He was no longer just the boy butcher of Sulla. He had become something else, a man who could subdue the world without chains, who could end war with settlements, who thought he might, perhaps, be not only feared, but just. But Rome had never liked clean victories. They did not trust generals who did not bleed. And while Pompey sailed into the dawn, the Senate began to grumble in the dusk. The sea once laughed at the laws of men. Until one rose who tamed it again. But winds return and tides remember. And glory fades like dying ember. The east shimmered with dust and gold, cities older than Rome herself, kings descended from gods, and palaces that bled incense and betrayal. Pompey entered not as a conqueror, but as a correction. The Republic had fumbled its grip on the east for too long, letting Mithridates, clever, cruel, undying, rise again and again like a curse unlearned. Lucullus had tried. Others had failed. But Pompey brought not only soldiers, he brought finality. He moved with deliberate grace, not seeking battles, but outcomes. His legions advanced like tides, his diplomacy cutting deeper than swords. Mithridates, so long the ghost of Roman nightmares, was driven from stronghold to shadow. Armenia trembled under Tigranes, who knelt not with dignity, but desperation. Syria was annexed without war. Cities that had feared Rome for decades now begged to be part of her. In every province he entered, Pompey left something behind: roads, tax systems, treaties, and governors. He reshaped the East not by sack, but by design. Kingdoms fell like pieces of a mosaic, not shattered but reassembled under a Roman eye. He stood in the theater at Amisos and refused to plunder. He spared enemies, listened to philosophers, corresponded with Eastern scholars. The sword he had drawn in youth now rested more often in its sheath. Rome had given him war. He gave it an empire. And still, he did not return home. He lingered, not in arrogance, but perhaps in fear. For he had become too great abroad. He had ruled too long without Roman eyes upon him. His letters to the Senate grew stiff. His requests, for land for his veterans, for ratification of his eastern settlements, were met with delay. Suspicion. Contempt. Crassus, in Rome, whispered of ambition. Cato denounced him without name. Cicero praised and feared in equal measure. The Senate, jealous of the man who had done what they could not, sought to wound him not with blades, but with silence. Pompey, in the marble courts of Antioch, felt the chill. He was still their servant. He believed that he had conquered not for crown, but for republic. But the republic had changed while he was away. Or perhaps it had only unmasked itself. He boarded the ship to return at last, crowned with triumphs, trailing maps reshaped by his hand, beloved by soldiers, and unknown again to the city that had first named him Magnus. He thought he was returning to gratitude. But the marble had cracked. He broke the kings but spared their thrones. And mapped the world in measured tones. Yet home is where the coldest war waits quiet behind Senate doors. He entered the city on wheels of gold. Trumpets, dancers, the scent of incense and trampled roses, a triumph 3 days long, for 3 separate victories, Africa, the sea, and the East. No Roman had ever celebrated such honor. Not Scipio. Not Marius. Not even Sulla. The people cheered, as they always did. They lined the streets to watch the spoils of Asia pass, ivory, silks, prisoners in chains, maps of kingdoms erased. They called him Imperator, Dominus, Magnus. And still he did not smile. Because Pompey knew what they did not, Rome smiles easiest before it bites. He dismounted from glory and walked into the Senate with the modesty of a citizen. He asked not for kingship. Not for dictatorship. Only for two things, that his eastern settlements be confirmed, and that land be given to his veterans, men who had followed him across deserts and mountains, who had not mutinied, who had made the republic vast. They hesitated. The Senate, shrunken in courage and swollen in pride, stalled. The optimates distrusted him. The populace resented him. Even Cicero, ever eloquent, wavered in his defense. Cato, wrapped in his cloak of austere virtue, blocked every measure. They whispered, too much power. Too much glory. Too far from Rome. Too close to monarchy. Pompey, who had bent empires, could not bend senators. He was not Caesar. He would not storm the forum. He was not Sulla. He would not draw lists. He waited, reasoned, pleaded with restraint. And the more he showed patience, the more they mistook it for weakness. His veterans waited in silence. The fields they had dreamed of remained dust. And Pompey, the savior of the East, became a man with no party, no voice, and no place. His statues remained, but his influence faded. To secure what he could not earn by law, he made an alliance not of conviction, but necessity. He turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and to Gaius Julius Caesar, a rising storm in a toga, charismatic, cunning, dangerous. The three of them, each with power the others lacked, formed what the Senate refused to name. The first Triumvirate. Not a legal office. Not a written pact. A shadow behind the marble, unspoken but undeniable. Rome was no longer ruled by law. It was ruled by balance, a fragile, shivering scale of ego and ambition. Pompey had entered the city as its greatest man. He would now fight to remain its equal. He brought the world and bowed his head. And still they starved the hands he led. For marble fears the man who wins. And hides its knives in legal skins. They met not in temples, but in whispers. Not in the curia, but in corners where Rome's true gravity pooled, private villas, shaded gardens, the spaces between laws where power lived unspoken. There, Pompey clasped hands with two men who shared nothing with him but the need to be obeyed. Crassus, vulgar, calculating, obscene in wealth. He had bought men the way others bought cattle, filled the forum with clients like a general fills ranks. He did not crave honor, only leverage. His fortune was a republic unto itself. And Caesar, brilliant, theatrical, dangerous. A patrician with a plebeian's fire, he moved like a man who saw farther than the horizon. Every gesture calculated, every defeat temporary. Pompey saw in him not just ambition, but inevitability. Together, they formed a force stronger than any consulship. Stronger than the Senate. They did not call it a triumvirate, for that would admit its truth. But Rome bent to it just the same. Each man gained. Crassus secured financial reforms and quiet protection for his vast interests. Caesar was given the consulship and, afterward, an extraordinary proconsular command in Gaul, a canvas for conquest and legend. And Pompey. Pompey finally saw his eastern acts ratified. His veterans received land. His authority, at last, respected in marble. But peace bought with compromise is never clean. They did not trust each other. Not fully. Crassus resented Pompey's laurels. Caesar admired and feared him. And Pompey, who had once stood alone in glory, now shared the shadows with men he would not have saluted a decade earlier. Worse still, Caesar married into Pompey's world. His daughter, Julia, became Pompey's wife, a gentle soul in a violent game. Her presence softened him, perhaps. Their marriage, unexpected in tenderness, became the thread that held the balance in place. For a time, it worked. Rome was quiet. Caesar fought in Gaul, sending back letters soaked in victory. Crassus schemed. Pompey watched. He was given command of Spain in name but remained in Rome, brooding, distant, dignified. The people still loved him. The Senate still feared him. But the winds had shifted. He was no longer the future. He was now the weight that steadied the present, and delayed the inevitable. Yet somewhere deep within, the boy who had ridden in golden chariots still stirred. He had been first among men. He had stood beside Sulla and returned triumphant from the world's edge. And now, he held power by alliance, not awe. He knew it would not last. The Triumvirate had been a pact of survival, not of faith. Rome was still a republic, in name only. And when one piece fell, the rest would follow. 3 men, 1 Rome, and time on fire. A thread of blood, a pact of wire. But every shared and silent throne waits for the day it stands alone. The knot unraveled not with swords, but with silence. No decree announced the beginning of the end, it came in breathless messengers, in black cloth over doorways, in grief that fell not only on households, but on history. Julia died. Pompey's wife. Caesar's daughter. The fragile bridge of blood that bound 2 worlds, 2 ambitions, 2 storms. She had given Pompey a child, and lost it. And then, not long after, her own life slipped quietly from the earth, leaving a chasm no law could span. Pompey mourned her deeply, more deeply than the Senate expected, more deeply than Caesar had hoped. Rome had long since stopped believing in marriages of affection. But this had been real. And with her death, the alliance began to rot. The funeral was quiet. Too quiet. Pompey, usually stoic, kept to his estate outside the city, walking the gardens alone, refusing to speak of the future. Caesar sent letters, courteous, political, cold. There was nothing now between them but old oaths and older suspicion. And then, far from Rome, the East beckoned again, this time to Crassus. Thirsting for his own triumph, jealous of Caesar's growing legend and Pompey's eternal fame, Crassus led a massive army into Parthia. He sought another East to tame, another empire to own. But fire does not respect wealth, and deserts do not kneel. At Carrhae, Crassus was slain. His army broken, his head sent eastward in mockery. No funeral. No triumph. Only dust and ruin. Now, the triangle was broken. Rome no longer balanced between 3 stars. There were 2 men left, and the sky was not large enough for both. Caesar was in Gaul, where victory followed his name like thunder. His soldiers adored him. His letters shaped opinion. His gold bought silence. And he had no intention of stepping down. Pompey was in Rome, appointed sole consul to restore order after the street riots and the collapse of authority. He passed laws with the air of reluctant necessity, but behind his eyes, the wheels turned. He reinforced the Senate's dignity. Restored its pride. He became, once again, the defender of tradition, though the tradition now bore cracks as deep as time. The Senate turned to him. Cato embraced him. Cicero praised him with cautious pen. They did not love him. But they feared Caesar more. And so Pompey, the boy general, the pirate slayer, the king crusher, became the last hope of the old order. But he was no longer the future. He was now a pillar holding a falling temple, upright, proud, and already trembling beneath the weight. When love is lost and fortune fades, the marble speaks in louder shades. A name once sung across the foam now holds a sword to guard a home. The river was shallow. Cold. It made no sound. No horns blared when Caesar crossed it, no thunder fell from the heavens. It was only water, but the line it marked was older than any empire. To cross it with an army was treason. To cross it with intent was war. Pompey received the news not with shock, but with a stillness that disturbed his advisers more than rage would have. He had expected it. For months, he had read Caesar's letters, smelled the storm behind their civility. Caesar wanted consulship. He wanted security. He wanted everything, and he would not return to Rome under the law's shadow. The Senate had pushed Caesar too far. Or perhaps not far enough. They gave Pompey command of the legions. They called upon him to save the Republic. Yet what was left of it? The Senate was no longer sovereign, only a frightened voice clinging to precedent. The Republic was not dead, but it had stopped breathing. And now it looked to Pompey, not as a peer, but as a wall to hold back the tide. He had more legions in name than Caesar. But they were scattered, unready, loyal to the state, not to him. Caesar's men were hardened by a decade of conquest. They followed a man, not a title. Pompey stood in Rome, the city he had once entered in triumph, the city he had served, fed, defended. And he made a choice. He left it. He fled south, to Capua, to Brundisium, to the ports where reinforcements might gather. He called it strategic withdrawal. He said he would raise a greater army, draw Caesar into the open, crush him far from the sacred stones of Rome. But to the people, it looked like surrender. He had not defended the city. He had abandoned it. Caesar entered without resistance. No fires. No blood. Only cheers and silence, and the knowledge that the line had been crossed, and one man had stepped forward while the other had stepped back. Pompey watched from afar, assembling men, sending letters, speaking of duty, of republic, of law. But something in the rhythm of power had shifted. He was still Magnus, but the name now echoed strangely in his ears. He had once been the future. Now he was the past pretending to be the present. Yet he was not broken. He still had the East, the provinces he had shaped, the fleets he had commanded, the men who remembered his greatness. He would draw Caesar into a foreign field. There, away from the crowds and columns, he would remind Rome why he had once been its savior. But another voice whispered in the wind, one Pompey tried not to hear. You have already lost. Not because you ran. But because the city did not call you back. The river crossed, the die was cast. The city wept, but not for past. And he who once held every throne now walked the roads of dust alone. He moved through familiar lands like a stranger. In Greece, in Asia, in the long arms of the East where once he had ruled like a second son, Pompey called again for loyalty, and they answered, but not as before. The legions came. The ships came. The king sent tribute and swords. But something was missing. Not numbers, but rhythm. The old rhythm of command, when a word from his lips set the world in motion, had faded. The machinery still turned, but with hesitation, with rust, with memory instead of fervor. The men respected him, but they did not love him. The provinces obeyed, but did not rise. He was not hated, he was remembered. And remembrance does not win wars. Caesar, behind him, moved like fire. Swift, unrelenting, decisive. His men were few, but each had followed him through Gaul, across rivers deeper than the Rubicon, through battles where Rome had watched and done nothing. They did not ask why they fought, they knew. They fought for him. And that made them dangerous. Pompey had more. More ships. More troops. More horses, nobles, and allies. The Senate had followed him east and still called him consul, savior, legitimate commander. They held meetings in exile, passed laws no one enforced, sent envoys that Caesar ignored. And Pompey listened to them, when he should have listened to the war. He gave speeches. He distributed commands. He consulted senators whose armor had not seen daylight in a decade. He planned a war not of movement, but of symbols. He forgot, in his careful steps, that Caesar did not believe in symbols anymore. He had shattered them all. His own officers grew restless. Men like Labienus, who had defected from Caesar, now found themselves among statues, not soldiers. The armies drilled but did not march. Supplies clogged the ports. Morale dipped. And Pompey, dignified and calm, mistook delay for strategy. Once, he had lived in momentum. Now, he governed hesitation. In quiet moments, he walked the coasts of Epirus, watching the waves and wondering where it had turned. Was it the Senate? The death of Julia? The day he left Rome not in chains, but in doubt. He did not fear Caesar's sword. He feared Caesar's clarity. The younger man believed in something. Pompey was still deciding what to defend. When word came that Caesar had crossed into Greece, Pompey stiffened. This was the moment. At last, the war would begin. But in his heart, another voice, small, buried deep, and spoken in no triumph, whispered. This is not your world anymore. The eagle's wings still cast a shade. But winds had changed, and stars had strayed. For he who once made empires kneel, now heard the silence in the steel. The plain was wide and dry, a theater fit for fate. Pharsalus lay beneath a haze of dust and tension, the hills watching like old men who had seen too many legends die. Pompey stood with the larger force, nearly double Caesar's number, nobles on horseback, infantry in rows, the Senate in exile beneath his banners. He should have won. He did not want to fight that day. Caution whispered to wait, to starve Caesar out, to use time as his ally. But pride, impatience, and the hunger of those around him pressed hard. Senators begged for battle, mocking delay as cowardice. Officers murmured about Caesar's audacity, his thin lines, his stolen victories. Pompey yielded, not to strategy, but to expectation. He arranged his men with care. Infantry 3 lines deep. Cavalry massed on the left wing. Behind them, senators watched in togas, not soldiers, but judges waiting to pass sentence. They had no idea they stood on a grave. Across the field, Caesar's forces stood smaller, leaner, but older in war. Their eyes held no doubt. They did not ask why they fought, they simply looked to him. And he, in silence, raised his hand. The lines moved. Pompey ordered his cavalry to sweep the field. A tide of horsemen crashed into Caesar's right, where only a few thousand men stood to meet them. But there, hidden behind the thin line, Caesar had placed a 4th rank. Young, silent, dagger-bearing infantry. They waited until the cavalry came close, and then they rose like a wall of ghosts. They did not fight with spears. They aimed for faces. Pompey's cavalry turned. Not routed. Shattered. They vanished in clouds of fear, their pride unseated by wounds they had never imagined. And the left crumbled. And the center weakened. And Caesar pressed forward. Pompey watched the line fold. His commands grew softer. His generals began to slip away. The dust hid shame. He mounted his horse, not to fight, but to flee. He left the field in silence. Caesar stood victorious, not by numbers, but by belief. He looked upon the corpses, the senators in chains, the dream of the republic bleeding on dry grass, and said, they would have it so. Pompey rode south, then to the coast. Alone. No trumpets. No followers. No dignity. In Rome, they once called him Magnus. Now, he was only a man with a name the wind no longer recognized. The stars that burned too long at height will fall in silence, not in fight. And glory, once so tightly held, will slip through hands that never knelt. The sea did not mourn him. It carried him gently, as it carries all things forgotten. Pompey the Great, once the master of oceans, now drifted not with fleets but on a single ship, a fugitive cloaked in exile, accompanied by shadows and loyalists too frightened to speak plainly. He landed at Pelusium, a worn corner of Egypt where history clings like dust and betrayal grows faster than grain. The boy King Ptolemy XIII ruled in name, but behind his throne stood men who knew Rome's mood better than its maps. Caesar was in pursuit. Pompey was a guest Rome no longer wished to feed. He sent word ashore, asking for audience. He believed still in his name, not as power, but as identity. Surely the East remembered. Surely Egypt, which owed her throne to Rome's good favor, would show the courtesy due to a Roman consul, a Roman savior. They replied with smiles. A small boat came to take him ashore. Not a barge, not a procession. Just a fishing skiff, painted with the salt of years. Pompey looked out at the land that had once trembled before his legions, and he stepped aboard. He did not wear armor. He did not clutch a sword. He carried with him only silence, and the dignity of a man who had already begun to speak with ghosts. As the boat reached the shore, he stood. One of the men beside him, a former officer of his own, rose too, but not to salute. The knife flashed quickly. No speech. No trial. Just the sea and the sand and a fall. They cut his head from his body and left the rest behind, to be eaten by wind and time. When Caesar arrived days later, the head was brought to him in a basket. He did not smile. He did not speak. He wept. Not for Pompey the rival. Not for Pompey the general. But for what had been lost, for the republic that could no longer bury its dead with honor. For the name that once ruled empires, now reduced to a token, a warning, a silence. In Rome, his statues remained for a while. His triumphs engraved in faded marble. His name whispered in old Senate records. But no crowds chanted. No poets sang. Pompey had been Rome's sword, her shield, her promise of order. He had marched further than most, bled less than many, but in the end, faded more quietly than all. He did not fall in battle, nor rise in legend. He was remembered only in contrast, as what had come before. And after him, the river no longer had borders. Only tides. No trumpet called. No eagle cried. The waves received him when he died. A name once carved in stone and sky. Now sleeps where empires go to lie.